The Red Ravens thought they ruled Pine Valley with their drunken chaos and senseless destruction. For months, they'd terrorized the peaceful mountain town, treating its streets like their personal playground, breaking whatever and whoever stood in their way. No business dared refuse them service. No citizen dared stand against them. Then they made the fatal mistake of targeting Jimmy's diner, not knowing its quiet owner had traded his mansion for an apron, his CEO title for a spatula, and his luxurious life for a higher purpose. They were about to learn why some people choose humility not from weakness, but because they know exactly what power they hold. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Jimmy's diner's windows as Marcus Chen wiped down the counter for the 10th time that hour. The small establishment's worn leather booths and chrome fixtures had seen better days, but every surface gleamed with the kind of care that came from genuine pride rather than obligation. The diner's ancient ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, their gentle whirring mixing with the soft country music playing from speakers that had probably been installed when Kennedy was president. To the regular customers enjoying their morning coffee, Marcus was simply the quiet man who'd bought Jimmy's place 3 years ago when old Jimmy Peterson finally retired. They knew him as the owner who remembered everyone's usual order, who never turned away a hungry person, even if they couldn't pay, and who somehow managed to make the best apple pie this side of the Rockies. What they didn't know was that before he wore this apron, Marcus Chen had commanded a special forces unit through 3 tours in Afghanistan, or that the modest apartment above his diner was a far cry from the $10 million estate he'd built. As the CEO of one of the country's largest defense contractors, Sarah Martinez, his only waitress for the morning shift, carried a fresh pot of coffee around the diner, topping off cups with practiced efficiency. She'd been working at Jimmy's since high school, long before Marcus took over, and she'd seen firsthand how he'd transformed not just the diner, but the lives of many in Pine Valley. "Mr. Chen," she called out, gesturing toward old Bill Thompson, seated in his usual corner booth. "Looks like Bill's ready for his second breakfast." Marcus smiled, already reaching for the griddle. Bill Thompson had been coming in twice every morning since his wife passed away last year, claiming Jimmy's was the only place that made eggs the way Martha used to make them. What he didn't know was that Marcus had secretly called Bill's daughter in Denver, learned Martha's exact recipe, and made sure every plate served to Bill carried a small taste of the love he'd lost. The morning regulars filtered in and out, their conversations creating a comfortable backdrop of small-town life. Farmers discussing the weather, teachers preparing for another school day, construction workers grabbing early lunch before heading to their sites. This was why Marcus had chosen this life, these moments of genuine connection that meant more than all the board meetings and profit margins of his past. Through the diner's front windows, Marcus watched Pine Valley coming to life. The small town nestled in Colorado's mountains had called to him after he'd sold his company, after he'd realized that all his wealth and success had left him feeling emptier than the days he'd spent in combat. Here, in this humble diner, he found something his mansion never gave him: purpose. Sarah's voice cut through his contemplation. "Did you hear about what happened at Mike's Hardware last night?" She kept her voice low, though concern edged her words. "The Red Ravens again. Broke all his windows because he refused to give them free supplies." Marcus nodded slowly, his practiced calm masking the tactical assessment happening behind his eyes. The Red Ravens had emerged in Pine Valley 6 months ago, a group of troubled young men whose liquid courage turned them into wrecking balls of destruction. They weren't organized criminals. They were chaos in human form, made unpredictable and dangerous by their constant state of intoxication and their need to prove themselves through violence. "Mike's the 3rd business this week," Sarah continued, glancing nervously at the door. "Police can't seem to do anything. They're always gone before deputies arrive, and no one's willing to press charges. They're scared of retaliation." Marcus continued his methodical cleaning of the counter, but his mind was already cataloguing everything he knew about the Red Ravens. 23 members, mostly local boys who'd fallen into the wrong crowd. Their leader, Jake Phoenix Morrison, had a reputation for explosive violence that grew worse with each bottle he emptied. They weren't calculating like the gangs Marcus had dealt with in his military days. They were wild cards, which in some ways made them more dangerous. Bell above the diner's door chimed as Mary Watson hurried in, her eyes red from crying. Marcus already had her usual tea brewing before she reached the counter. "They hit your flower shop too?" he asked gently, though he already knew the answer from her expression. Mary nodded, her hands shaking as she accepted the warm cup. "All. My displays, all the arrangements for the Anderson wedding, they destroyed everything. Said it was payment for refusing to serve them last week when they were too drunk to stand." The diner had grown quiet, other customers listening with a mix of sympathy and fear. This was Pine Valley's new reality, waiting to see who would be next, who would face the Red Ravens' alcohol-fueled rage. But as Marcus served Mary a slice of pie on the house, his quiet exterior masked something his customers couldn't see. The tactical mind of a special forces commander assessing a threat, and the strategic brilliance of a CEO who'd built an empire analyzing patterns and weaknesses. Let them drink, let them laugh, let them think they own these streets. Marcus knew something they didn't. Some storms come not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet precision of a man who'd learned the true meaning of power and who'd chosen to use it not for himself, but for those who couldn't protect themselves. The first signs of trouble arrived with the afternoon storm clouds. Marcus was in the kitchen, preparing his signature meatloaf, when he heard the distinct rumble of modified trucks approaching, the Red Ravens' preferred mode of transportation. Through the kitchen window, he watched 3 lifted pickups pull into his parking lot, their engines unnecessarily loud, their exhausts spewing black smoke into the mountain air. Sarah's face paled as she glanced through the service window. "Mr. Chen..." Her voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide. The lunch crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few regulars who suddenly seemed very interested in their coffee cups. "It's all right, Sarah," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the same calm it had when he'd commanded men through firefights in distant mountains. "Just treat them like any other customer." But even as he spoke, his mind was already mapping the diner's layout, noting potential threats and advantages, old habits that had never quite faded. The diner's door slammed open, bell jangling violently, as 6 members of the Red Ravens stumbled in, reeking of cheap whiskey and cheaper cologne. Their leader, Jake Morrison, wore his signature red leather jacket despite the summer heat, his glassy eyes scanning the diner with artificial menace. "Well, well," Jake's words slurred slightly as he dropped heavily into a booth, his companions spreading out through the diner. "Heard this place makes the best pie in the valley. Thought we'd come see for ourselves." Marcus watched through the kitchen window as Sarah approached their table, order pad in hand, her professional smile firmly in place despite her obvious anxiety. The other customers remained still, trying to make themselves invisible, all too aware of the Red Raven's reputation. "Welcome to Jimmy's," Sarah's voice carried steady, though Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly. "What can I get for you today?" Jake's laugh carried no humor. "Heard the owner here thinks he's too good for our kind. Been avoiding our little protection arrangement. Isn't that right, boys?" His companions muttered agreement, their unfocused eyes roaming the diner's interior. Through the kitchen window, Marcus observed their positioning, their movements, their level of intoxication. His trained eye noted the poorly concealed knife in one man's boot, the bulge of brass knuckles in another's pocket. They were dangerous. Yes, but sloppy, unpredictable but undisciplined. "Tell your boss to get his ass out here," Jake commanded Sarah, his voice rising. "Time we had a chat about community support." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. The contrast was striking. The quiet diner owner in his simple work clothes facing the leather-clad, intoxicated troublemakers. But there was something in his stance, something in the way he moved, that made two of the ravens shift uncomfortably. "In their seats, I'm Marcus Chen," he said simply, his voice carrying neither fear nor challenge. "Welcome to my diner. Sarah will be happy to take your order if you're here to eat." Jake stood, swaying slightly, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate. "You're the one been ignoring our friendly business proposals? The one who thinks he's too good to pay for protection?" He gestured around the diner. "Nice place you got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." Thunder rolled outside as the storm approached, nature providing an ominous backdrop to the growing tension. The remaining customers had gone completely, still watching the confrontation unfold. But Marcus remained unchanged, his calm presence almost unsettling in its absoluteness. "I operate an honest business here," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I serve good food at fair prices, that's all." There was something in his eyes, though, something that made one of the younger ravens take a small step back. It wasn't fear or anger. It was the kind of focused awareness that comes from years of assessing genuine threats. Jake, too drunk to read the subtle warnings, stepped closer. "Maybe you don't understand how things work here now, old man. We own this valley. Everyone pays. Everyone shows respect." He reached out to poke Marcus's chest with his finger. Before his hand made contact, Marcus shifted slightly, a movement so subtle it was almost invisible, but one that placed him in a perfect position to respond if needed. It was the kind of movement that comes from years of combat training, of knowing exactly how to control a situation without appearing to move at all. "I think," Marcus said quietly, "that you gentlemen should sober up. Come back when you're ready to be customers, rather than threats." One of the older ravens, a man who'd served briefly in the military before being discharged, caught something in Marcus's stance that set off warning bells in his mind. "Boss," he muttered, "maybe we should hit the bar instead. Come back another time." But Jake was too far gone, too invested in his display of power to back down now. He grabbed a coffee cup from a nearby table and hurled it against the wall, the crash echoing through the suddenly silent diner. Nobody tells the red ravens what to do, old man, nobody. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain beginning to pound against the diner's windows. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark relief. The drunk rebels, the frightened customers, and Marcus Chen, still standing calm and unmoved, like a rock in a turbulent sea. What the red ravens couldn't know, what their alcohol-clouded minds couldn't comprehend, was that they weren't facing a simple diner owner. They were challenging a man who had led elite troops through the world's worst combat zones, who had built a billion-dollar empire through strategic brilliance, and who had chosen this quiet life not out of weakness, but out of a deep understanding of what real strength meant. The storm was about to teach them that lesson, though not in the way they expected. Jake's next move proved exactly why drunk men shouldn't try to make points with violence. He grabbed the edge of the nearest table, sending plates and cups crashing to the floor in a spray of ceramic and coffee. The sound made several customers flinch, but Marcus didn't even blink. His eyes remained focused, calculating, as if watching a chess match rather than vandalism. "Still feeling calm, old man?" Jake sneered, his alcohol-fueled bravado growing with each act of destruction. "Still think you can ignore the red ravens?" He turned to his crew, spreading his arms wide. "Boys, show him what happens to businesses that don't respect our arrangement." The ravens spread through the diner, their movements clumsy but purposeful. One began overturning chairs, another smashed a glass display case containing homemade pies. Sarah pressed herself against the back wall, phone in hand, though they all knew the local police were at least 15 minutes away. An eternity in situations like this. Marcus watched it all with an unsettling stillness. Not the stillness of fear, but the kind of focused calm that combat veterans recognize, the calm before decisive action. His mind catalogued each raven's position, noted their levels of intoxication, assessed their potential threats. The younger ones were drunk enough to be dangerous but uncoordinated. The older ones, especially the ex-military member, showed signs of hesitation. "Last chance," Marcus said quietly, his voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "Leave now and we can forget this happened. Stay, and you'll learn things about yourself you might not want to know." Jake laughed, the sound harsh and artificial. He grabbed a coffee pot, steam still rising from its contents. "You hear this guy? Thinks he's some kind of action hero." He turned toward Sarah, the hot coffee sloshing dangerously. "Maybe we should teach him what happens when people try to play hero in Pine Valley." The change in Marcus was subtle but profound. Something shifted in his stance, a minute adjustment that transformed the humble diner owner into something else entirely. The ex-military Raven saw it first, his alcohol-dulled instincts screaming warnings he couldn't quite process. "Boss," he started to say, "something ain't right here," but Jake was beyond warning. He took a step towards Sarah, coffee pot raised. "Time to learn some respect." What happened next seemed to defy physics. Marcus moved with a speed and precision that made the Raven's drunken aggression look like children's play. One moment he stood behind the counter, the next he was between Jake and Sarah, the coffee pot somehow in his hand rather than Jake's, its contents never having spilled a drop. "How did you—" Jake's confusion quickly turned to anger. He swung. A wild punch, the kind of sloppy haymaker that drunk men favor. Marcus didn't block it or dodge it in any dramatic way. He simply wasn't where the punch landed, having shifted exactly 3 inches to the side with an economy of movement that spoke of years of training. "Stand down," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new tone, one of command rather than request. "You're embarrassing yourself." 2 of the Ravens moved to flank him, trying to corner him against the counter. To the untrained eye, they had the advantage. To Marcus, they had just made their first tactical error. His awareness extended to every detail, the way the linoleum floor had just been mopped, making it slick in spots, the exact distance to the support beam behind him, the position of every potential weapon or obstacle in reach. Jake pulled a switchblade from his pocket, the blade snapping open with a click that seemed too loud in the suddenly quiet diner. "Not so calm now, are you?" He gestured to his men. "Show him what happens to people who don't respect." The ex-military Raven suddenly grabbed Jake's arm. "Boss, wait. Look at how he's standing. That's not—" But it was too late. Jake shrugged off the warning and lunged forward with the knife. What followed was a lesson in the difference between violence and control, between aggression and mastery. Marcus moved like water, efficient and unstoppable. The knife never came close to its target, and Jake found himself suddenly, inexplicably, face down on the counter, his arm locked behind him at an angle that promised agony if he struggled. The other Ravens stood frozen, their alcohol-addled minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Their leader, who had terrorized Pine Valley for months, had been neutralized in less time than it takes to flip a pancake, and the man who did it hadn't even seemed to exert himself. Like I said, Marcus's voice remained calm, though now it carried echoes of other times, other places where he'd commanded men in far darker situations. "You should have left when you had the chance. Now we're going to have a conversation about choices, about consequences, and about what real strength looks like." Outside, the storm continued to rage, lightning illuminating the diner in strobing flashes that made the scene seem almost surreal. But what was about to unfold was more real than anything the Red Ravens had ever experienced. They were about to learn that true power doesn't come from alcohol-fueled bravado or small-town intimidation. It comes from the kind of discipline and control that only those who have faced real battles can understand. And Marcus Chen, The quiet diner owner who had traded wealth for purpose was about to give them that lesson in full. The diner had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the storm outside and Jake's muffled protests against the counter. The remaining ravens stood frozen, their drunk bravado evaporating as they watched their leader rendered helpless by the man they'd dismissed as just another small-town business owner. "You know what the hardest part of Special Forces training was?" Marcus asked conversationally, maintaining his hold on Jake with seemingly no effort. "Learning when not to fight. Understanding that true strength isn't about how much damage you can do, but how much you can prevent." The ex-military raven, who'd tried to warn his boss earlier, took a small step forward. "Your Special Forces?" His voice carried recognition now, memories of his brief military service helping him piece together what he'd seen in Marcus's movements. "Was," Marcus corrected gently. "Now I make apple pie and serve coffee. At least, that's what I'd prefer to do." He adjusted his hold slightly as Jake tried to struggle, the movement so precise it looked almost choreographed. "But sometimes we don't get to choose our moments, do we?" Sarah had moved away from the wall, her initial fear replaced by fascination as she watched her quiet employer transform into something entirely different. The remaining customers, who had pressed themselves into corners during the initial confrontation, began to straighten up, sensing the shift in power dynamics. 20 years, Marcus continued, his voice carrying through the diner like a quiet storm. 20 years in places you've never heard of, doing things that never made the news. Then I came home, built a defense company, made more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. He paused, letting the words sink in. And you know what I learned? Jake had stopped struggling, whether from the discomfort of his position or the growing realization that he'd severely miscalculated. The other ravens watched, transfixed, as their world of small-town intimidation collided with something far beyond their experience. I learned that power isn't about making others fear you. It's about having the strength to choose peace when you could choose violence. It's about serving others when you could dominate them. Marcus's words carried no boast, just quiet certainty, born of hard-won wisdom. The ex-military raven, whose name patch on his jacket read Cooper, took another step forward. "You're Marcus Chen, Chen Defense Solutions." It wasn't a question. "You're the one who revolutionized battlefield protection systems. Your company saved thousands of soldiers' lives." A small smile touched Marcus's lips. "That was another life. Now I make what some people say is the best meatloaf in Colorado." He looked around at the destruction the ravens had caused. "Though, at the moment, I seem to be giving a lesson in choices and consequences." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the scene through the diner's windows. In that stark light, the ravens could see what they'd missed before. The way Marcus stood, the precision of his control, the absolute certainty in his bearing. This wasn't just a man who knew how to fight. This was someone who had mastered the art of conflict itself. "Your company," Cooper continued, his voice carrying a mix of awe and dawning horror at what they'd done. "It was worth billions. You sold it 2 years ago, disappeared. Nobody knew where you went." "I went looking for something money couldn't buy," Marcus replied. "Purpose, connection, the kind of peace that comes from serving others rather than profiting from them." His eyes scanned the group. "Something I suspect all of you are looking for too, though you're searching in all the wrong places." The youngest raven, barely out of his teens, suddenly dropped the chair he'd been holding as a weapon. The crash seemed to break some sort of spell, and the others began to lower their own implements of destruction, as if finally seeing them for what they were, poor substitutes for real strength. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority. "I'm going to release your leader. You're all going to sit down, sober up, and we're going to have a conversation about what real power looks like. about why a man who could buy this entire town chose to serve its people instead. He looked directly at Cooper. "And you're going to help them understand, aren't you? Because you remember, don't you? The person you were before the discharge, before the drinking, before you started following men who mistake cruelty for strength." Cooper's face showed the impact of the words, recognition and shame warring in his expression. "Yes, sir," he replied automatically, military bearing briefly reasserting itself through the alcohol haze. With careful precision, Marcus released his hold on Jake, helping him regain his balance rather than letting him fall. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the difference between dominance and true strength. Jake straightened up, rubbing his arm, his face a complex mix of anger, fear, and confusion. "Now," Marcus said, moving to the coffee maker with calm deliberateness, "who wants a cup of coffee? The real kind, not the sort you were planning to throw at my waitress." He began preparing fresh cups, his movements returning to those of a simple diner owner, though now everyone present knew that simplicity was a choice rather than a limitation. The storm outside began to ease, its violence giving way to a steady rain, as if nature itself was settling in to witness what would happen. Next, the Red Ravens were about to learn that sometimes the greatest shows of strength come not from displays of power, but from the choice to use that power for something greater than oneself. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the diner as Marcus methodically prepared cups for everyone present. His movements were unhurried, precise, each gesture carrying the same focused attention he'd shown during the confrontation. The Ravens watched him, their earlier bravado replaced by an uncertain silence, as if they'd stumbled into something. They couldn't quite comprehend. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Marcus asked, placing cups in front of each man with careful deliberation. "I see myself, 25 years ago, fresh out of my first combat tour, angry at a world that didn't make sense anymore, looking for something to fight because fighting was all I understood." Jake, still rubbing his arm where Marcus had restrained him, stared into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers. The liquid reflected his face, showing him something he hadn't seen in a long time. Uncertainty, vulnerability, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade of toughness. "Sir," Cooper spoke up, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as the alcohol's effects began to fade. "Your company, the protection systems you developed, my brother served in Afghanistan. He said your body armor saved his whole unit." "During an ambush," Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without pride. "Technology can protect the body," he said, starting to clean up the broken dishes from the floor. "But it's purpose that protects the soul. Something I didn't understand. When I was building my empire, Sarah began helping with the cleanup, her earlier fear completely gone. She'd seen something in her boss that changed everything, not just his capability for controlled violence, but his deeper capacity for understanding and transformation. "You had everything." One of the younger Ravens spoke up, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and awe. "Money, power, respect. Why would you give that up to run a diner in the middle of nowhere?" Marcus paused in his cleaning, looking at the young man with genuine attention. "Because success without purpose is just another form of failure. I could buy anything I wanted, but I couldn't buy meaning, couldn't buy connection, couldn't buy the feeling you get when you serve others instead of yourself." The storm outside had settled into a gentle rain, its rhythmic pattering against the windows, providing a backdrop to the transformation occurring within the diner. The remaining customers who had stayed to witness everything began to relax, sensing that the danger had passed and something more profound was taking its place. "Look at your hands," Marcus instructed the Ravens. They did, seeing the scrapes and bruises from their recent destructive activities. "Now look at mine." He held up his own hands, showing calluses from kitchen work mixed with old scars from combat. These hands have taken lives in war, built a billion-dollar company, and now they make coffee and meatloaf. Which version of me do you think sleeps better at night?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You trying to tell us we should what? Give up? Become soft? This valley respects strength. We showed them what real strength looks like." "No," Marcus corrected gently. "You showed them what fear looks like. Fear wearing a mask of strength. I've seen real strength. It's the single mother working 3 jobs to put her kid through college. It's the old veteran who volunteers at the shelter despite his own PTSD. It's people choosing to build rather than destroy, to lift others up rather than tear them down." Cooper stood suddenly, removing his Red Raven's jacket. The leather hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the diner. "He's right, boss," he said, addressing Jake but looking at Marcus. "We've been playing at being tough guys, but we're just scared kids trying to make the world make sense again." The action seemed to break something in the group's dynamic. Another Raven, then another, began removing their jackets. Each leather hitting the floor was like a weight being lifted, a facade being stripped away. "You want to know what real power looks like?" Marcus asked, but his tone made it clear he wasn't really asking. "It's having the ability to destroy and choosing to create instead. It's having every reason to be bitter and choosing to be kind. It's having the skills to dominate and choosing to serve." He gestured around the diner at the mess they'd made. "You came in here thinking you'd teach me about respect through fear. Instead, I'm going to teach you about respect through purpose. Tomorrow morning, you're all going to come back here, sober, and help repair what you've damaged. Then, we're going to talk about what you're really looking for and why you haven't found it at the bottom of those whiskey bottles." The transformation in the room was palpable. The Red Ravens, who had entered as drunk, aggressive thugs, now sat like chastened students, seeing themselves through new eyes. The very air seemed to have changed, from tension and fear to something approaching possibility. "But first," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded elite troops and corporate boardrooms alike, "you're going to apologize to Sarah, to my customers, and then you're going to start making better choices, because the strength you're looking for, it was never going to be found in causing pain. It's found in preventing it." Outside, the clouds began to part, letting the first rays of late afternoon sun pierce through. The light streamed through the diner's windows, illuminating the scattered Red Raven's jackets on the floor, symbols of false strength being replaced by something far more powerful, the possibility of genuine purpose. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows, Marcus began brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The Ravens sat in contemplative silence, their earlier aggression replaced by something approaching humility. Jake stared at his reflection in the chrome napkin holder, seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time in months. "Tell me about your father, Jake," Marcus said quietly, measuring coffee grounds with the same precision he'd shown in combat. The question caught Jake off guard, his head snapping up in surprise. "What's my old man got to do with anything?" Jake's voice carried a defensive edge, but beneath it lay something more vulnerable. 20 years in special forces taught me to read people," Marcus replied, starting the coffee maker. "The way you carry anger, the need to prove yourself through intimidation. Those aren't just drunk impulses, they're echoes of something deeper." Sarah moved quietly through the diner, righting overturned chairs and collecting broken pieces of crockery. The remaining customers watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and growing understanding. This wasn't just about a confrontation anymore. It was about unraveling the knots that had tied these young men to violence. "Marine Corps Colonel," Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "never could live up to his standards. Nothing was ever good enough, never strong enough, never tough enough." His hands clenched into fists on the table. "Bet he'd Love seeing me now, drunk and pathetic, getting taken down by a diner owner. Marcus poured fresh coffee for everyone, the aromatic steam rising like memories between them. My father was a refugee, he said, settling into a chair across from Jake. Escaped China with nothing but his skills as a cook. Worked 18-hour days in other people's restaurants so I could go to school. I built a billion-dollar company, trying to prove something to a man who was already proud of me for simply being kind to others. Cooper, the ex-military raven, leaned forward. That's why you sold everything. Why you chose this. He gestured around the modest diner. I spent years protecting soldiers with technology, Marcus explained, but I wasn't protecting their spirits, their sense of purpose. When I came home from my last tour, I had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. Sound familiar? The younger ravens exchanged glances, recognition dawning in their eyes. Each of them carried similar wounds, fathers who never approved, families who didn't understand, a world that seemed to make sense only through the lens of aggression. You know what I see in this group? Marcus continued, his voice carrying no judgment. I see Cooper, who served with honor until a bad discharge left him feeling worthless. I see Michael, he nodded to one of the younger ravens, whose brother died in Afghanistan, leaving him with rage he doesn't know how to process. I see Tom, who lost his construction business in the pandemic and thinks strength means never showing vulnerability. Each man startled as Marcus named their hidden burdens, wounds they'd tried to drown in alcohol and violence. The afternoon light painted everything in soft gold, making the moment feel almost sacred. How? Tom, the former construction worker, struggled to find words. How do you know all this? Because I've carried those same wounds, Marcus replied simply. The difference is, I found a better way to heal them. Not through dominance, but through service. Not through fear, but through purpose. Sarah returned to the counter, listening intently as she worked. She'd known Marcus for 3 years, but was hearing parts of his story for the first time. The quiet man who made the best apple pie in Colorado had depths she'd never imagined. When I sold my company, Marcus continued, people thought I was crazy, walking away from power, from influence, from everything society says matters. But sitting here, serving coffee to neighbors, cooking meals that bring comfort to people who need it, I've found something worth more than all the billions I left behind. Jake looked around the diner, seeing it with new eyes. The worn booths weren't signs of poverty, but of welcome, each scuff mark telling stories of countless conversations, of lives intersecting, of community being built one cup of coffee at a time. The Red Ravens, he said slowly. We thought we were building something too, thought fear would earn us respect. But all we built was walls between us and everything real. Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. Strength built on fear is like a house built on sand. True strength? It comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down, from protecting, not threatening, from serving, not dominating. The sun had begun its descent behind Pine Valley's mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Through the diner's windows, the town was visible. Shopkeepers closing up, families heading home, the simple rhythm of small town. Life continuing despite the drama that had unfolded within these walls. Tomorrow morning, Marcus said, standing to clean up the last of the broken dishes, you'll come back here and we'll start rebuilding, not just the damage to the diner, but everything else that's broken. Because that's what real warriors do. We rebuild, we restore, we protect. We choose a better way. The ravens sat in thoughtful silence. Their world shifted on its axis by a man who had traded empire for purpose, power for peace, and in doing so had shown them a strength they never knew existed. The peace of the moment was shattered by the roar of engines outside. Through the diner's windows, 4 more trucks pulled into the lot, their headlights cutting through the evening dusk. The remaining Red Ravens tensed as they recognized the vehicles. The rest of their crew had arrived, and they hadn't witnessed the transformation that had occurred inside. "Looks like we're about to find out if your lessons stick," Marcus said, calmly, though his eyes had already mapped exit routes and potential defensive positions. The tactical mind never truly rested. Jake stood up, his face a complex mix of emotions. They won't understand. They're drunk, angry, and probably looking for a fight. He turned to Marcus. "They're what we were an hour ago." The diner's door burst open as 8 more ravens stumbled in, their alcohol-fueled bravado filling the space with tension. Their leader, a hulking man they called Brick, took in the scene, the discarded jackets on the floor, his crew sitting calmly with coffee cups, and Marcus standing quietly behind the counter. "What the hell is this?" Brick's voice boomed through the diner. "Got a call saying you boys were having trouble with some uppity diner owner. Looks more like you're having a tea party." Cooper stood, positioning himself between the new arrivals. "And Marcus, stand down, Brick. You don't understand what's happening here." "I understand plenty," Brick snarled, alcohol making his movements jerky and aggressive. "Understand you're all sitting here like whipped dogs while our reputation goes down the drain." He pointed at Marcus. "This the one causing problems? Don't look so tough to me." Marcus hadn't moved from behind the counter, his stillness a stark contrast to Brick's agitated movements. "Your friends just learned an important lesson about real strength," he said quietly. "You're welcome to learn it too. Only lesson being, taught tonight is what happens to people who don't respect the Red Ravens." Brick pulled a heavy chain from his jacket pocket, wrapping it around his fist. "Been wanting to make an example of someone. Looks like you volunteered." Jake stepped forward. "Don't do this, Brick. He's not what you think. He's dead," Brick cut him off. "And after we're done with him, you traitors are next. Boys, show them what happens to ravens who go soft." What followed was a lesson in the difference between drunken aggression and mastered violence. Brick swung the chain in a wide arc, aiming to cause maximum damage, but Marcus moved like flowing water. His movements so precise and efficient, they seemed almost gentle. The chain whipped through empty air, as Marcus simply wasn't where the attack had targeted. "Last chance," Marcus offered, his voice still calm and measured. "Put the weapon down, sober up, and join your friends in choosing a better path." Brick's response was a roar of rage as he charged forward, his followers moving to surround Marcus, but they found their path blocked by Jake, Cooper, and the other transformed ravens who had taken up defensive positions around the diner. "You don't have to do this," Jake called to his former drinking buddies. "There's another way, a better way." But alcohol and pride made them deaf to reason. The next few moments were a symphony of controlled chaos as Marcus demonstrated why Special Forces operators were considered among the world's most lethal warriors, not through brutality, but through perfect control and precision. Brick's chain became a liability rather than a weapon as Marcus redirected its momentum using the drunk man's own force against him. Each wild swing was met with calculated movement, each aggressive rush turned aside with minimal effort. The other ravens who had attacked found themselves disabled with surgical precision, their drunken strength useless against years of elite training. "Watch carefully," Marcus instructed the transformed ravens who stood with him. "This is what we talked about, using just enough force to control, not to harm. Protection, not destruction." Within moments, Brick found himself face down on the diner floor, his chain now used to secure his own hands. His followers were similarly neutralized, some by Marcus, others by their own former companions who had learned from watching his example. "You know what the hardest part of Special Forces training was?" Marcus asked Brick, his voice carrying no mockery, only genuine instruction. "Learning that the goal isn't to defeat your enemy, but to create a situation where he stops being your enemy." Sarah, who had watched everything from behind the counter, finally spoke up. "They need to see, Mr. Chen. Show them what they're really fighting against." Marcus nodded, understanding her meaning. He reached into his back office and returned with a folder, dropping it on the table where Brick could see it. Inside were photographs. Marcus in full combat gear with his Special Forces team. Marcus in an expensive suit, accepting industry awards. Newspaper clippings about the billions he'd made, revolutionizing military defense technology. "You think you're tough because you can terrorize a small town?" Marcus asked quietly. "I've commanded men in real combat, built an empire that protected thousands of soldiers and walked away from it all because I found something more valuable: purpose. Real strength isn't about making others fear you. It's about having the power to destroy and choosing to protect instead." The evening light painted shadows across the diner floor as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the mountains. In that growing darkness, the Red Ravens faced a choice: continue down their path of destructive behavior or accept the hand being offered to guide them toward something better. The true test wasn't in the physical confrontation that had just ended, but in what would happen next, in whether these lost souls could find the courage to choose a different kind of strength. In the dim evening light of the diner, Brick stared at the photographs spread before him, his worldview crumbling like the facade of toughness he'd built around himself. The images told a story he couldn't deny: Marcus in combat zones, in corporate boardrooms, in positions of real power that made the Red Raven's small-town intimidation seem childish in comparison. "You're him," Brick whispered, recognition finally dawning through his alcohol-addled mind. "You're the Chen who developed the dragon-scale body armor. My cousin, he was in Fallujah, said that armor saved his whole unit." Marcus helped Brick into a sitting position, removing the chain that had been used to restrain him. "That technology protected bodies," he said quietly, "but it couldn't protect spirits, couldn't shield souls from the kind of damage we're really dealing with here." The other newly arrived Ravens, seeing their leader's transformation from belligerence to bewilderment, began to lower their guard. Cooper and Jake moved among them, helping them into seats, while Sarah silently began preparing more coffee. The diner had become a crucible where false strength was being burned away, revealing something more genuine underneath. "I don't understand," one of Brick's followers spoke up. "You had everything: money, power, respect. Why would you choose this?" He gestured around the modest diner, still showing signs of their earlier destruction. Marcus began cleaning up broken glass from their second confrontation, his movements deliberate and focused. Because real power isn't found in boardrooms or bank accounts. It's found in the choice to serve rather than dominate, to build rather than destroy. He paused, looking at each of the Ravens in turn. "Look at your hands," he instructed again, repeating the lesson from earlier. "Really look at them. How many things have they broken? How many people have they hurt? Now imagine using those same hands to build something, to help someone, to create rather than destroy." Brick stared at his own hands, calloused from fights and rough living. "Wouldn't know where to start," he admitted, vulnerability creeping into his voice for the first time. "You start right here," Marcus replied, handing him a broom. "Tomorrow morning, all of you will return, sober, and we'll begin rebuilding. Not just the diner, but yourselves, your sense of purpose, your understanding of what strength really means." Jake stepped forward, addressing his former drinking buddies. "An hour ago, I was just like you. Thought being feared meant being respected. But look at him." He gestured to Marcus. "He could destroy any of us without breaking a sweat. Instead, he chooses to serve coffee and make pie. That's real strength, having the power and choosing not to use it." Sarah brought out fresh cups of coffee, serving them with a quiet dignity that made several Ravens shift uncomfortably as they remembered their earlier threatening behavior. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying newfound confidence, "maybe you should tell them about the veterans program. Marcus nodded, pulling up a chair. Every Sunday, I host a group of veterans at the diner, men and women who've seen real combat, who've carried real power, who are learning to find purpose in civilian life. You're all welcome to join us, to learn what we learned, that the warrior spirit isn't about destruction, it's about protection. Cooper, who had attended one of these sessions before joining the Red Ravens, spoke up. It's not therapy, not exactly. It's about remembering who we were before the anger, before the drinking. About finding a way to use our strength to build something better. The transformation in the room was palpable. Men who had entered ready for violence now sat in contemplative silence, their worldview shifting like tectonic plates beneath their feet. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the mountain sky, witnesses to the change occurring within the diner's walls. "I've got a construction business," Tom, one of the earlier converted ravens, said suddenly. "Or had one before the pandemic hit, could use some strong hands to help rebuild it. Better than using those hands to tear things down." Marcus smiled slightly, seeing the first seeds of change beginning to sprout. That's how it starts. One choice, one moment of deciding to be better than you were yesterday. The strength you've been looking for. It was never going to be found in making others fear you. It's found in helping others overcome their fears. Brick stood slowly, his massive frame somehow less threatening now, more uncertain. With deliberate movements, he removed his Red Raven's jacket, adding it to the pile of discarded leather on the floor. "You really think we can change, just like that?" "Not just like that," Marcus corrected gently. "Change is hard work. It's a choice you have to make every day, every moment. But yes, you can change. I've seen it happen. I've lived it." He gestured around the diner. "This place? It's not just a restaurant. It's a reminder that we all have the power to choose a different path, one by one." The remaining ravens began removing their jackets, each leather hitting the floor like the shedding of an old skin. The symbolic act carried weight, a visible representation of an internal shift that was just beginning. Night had fully settled over Pine Valley, but Jimmy's diner glowed with more than just electric light. It radiated the kind of warmth that comes from witnessing transformation, from seeing the first moments of redemption take root in uncertain soil. These men who had entered as threats were leaving as something else. Not yet transformed, but taking their first steps on a path toward something better. And in the quiet of the mountain night, that was enough of a beginning. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Pine Valley, the mountain air carrying the scent of possibility. Marcus arrived at the diner well before sunrise, as was his habit, to begin preparations for the day. He wasn't surprised to find Cooper already waiting outside, sober and clear-eyed for the first time in months. "Couldn't sleep," Cooper admitted as Marcus unlocked the door. "Kept thinking about everything you said, everything you showed us." He followed Marcus inside, looking around at the damage from the previous evening with new eyes. "We really made a mess of things, didn't we?" "Messes can be cleaned up," Marcus replied, starting the coffee maker. "It's what we learn while cleaning them that matters." The sun was just beginning to paint the mountains gold when the first trucks arrived. Jake, Brick, and the others pulled into the parking lot, their arrival markedly different from the previous day. No revving engines, no aggressive displays, just quiet purpose as they filed into the diner. "Wasn't sure you'd all come," Marcus said, noting their clear eyes and steady hands. The previous night's alcohol had been replaced by something resembling determination. "Almost didn't," Brick admitted, his massive frame somehow less intimidating in the morning light. "Easier to stay angry, you know. Easier to keep breaking things than to fix them." Marcus began distributing cleaning supplies, tools, and materials he'd gathered for the repairs. Easier isn't always better. Sometimes the hardest path leads to the best destination. As the morning progressed, word spread through Pine Valley. People drove by slowly, watching in amazement as the red ravens, who had terrorized the town for months, worked alongside Marcus to repair the diner. Some stopped to watch, then stayed to help. Mary Watson from the flower shop arrived with fresh coffee and pastries. "Heard what happened yesterday," she said, setting down the boxes. "Heard what you did, Marcus, what you showed them." She looked at the ravens with something approaching understanding rather than fear. Mike from the hardware store showed up next, carrying supplies. "Thought you might need these," he said gruffly, but his eyes held respect as he watched the former. Troublemakers working diligently to repair what they'd broken. The transformation wasn't just in the physical repairs. As they worked, Marcus moved among them, teaching more than just how to fix broken fixtures. He taught them about precision, about taking pride in work well done, about the satisfaction of creating rather than destroying. "See this joint?" Demonstrated to Tom, who was repairing a broken booth. "It's not just about making it strong, it's about making it right. Every detail matters, just like in life. Cut corners here, it shows up later." Sarah arrived for her shift to find the diner, full of activity, but not the kind she'd feared. The men who had threatened her the day before now worked with focused determination, occasionally stopping to apologize again for their previous behavior. "Mr. Chen," she said, watching the scene unfold, "this is about more than just fixing the diner, isn't it?" Marcus nodded, showing Cooper how to properly repair a cracked window frame. "Everything's a lesson if you look at it right." These men needed to learn that building takes more strength than destroying, that precision matters more than power, that service brings more satisfaction than dominance. By midday, news had spread further. The sheriff stopped by, watching with measured surprise as former troublemakers worked alongside business owners they'd once terrorized. Local veterans began showing up, drawn by word of what had happened, offering help and, more importantly, understanding. "Heard you're running some kind of program here," one veteran said to Marcus, watching the transformation taking place. "Helping lost warriors find their way back." "Every Sunday," Marcus replied, not pausing in his work. "Coffee, conversation, and remembering who we were meant to be. You're welcome to join us." Jake, overhearing, looked up from where he was cleaning broken glass. "We'll be there," he said firmly. "All of us, if you'll have us." The ripple effects continued throughout the day. Other business owners who'd suffered damage from the Red Ravens found their properties being quietly repaired. The Ravens understanding. Now what Marcus had taught them about strength through service took it upon themselves to right their previous wrongs. "This is how change happens," Marcus explained to Sarah as they watched brick carefully hanging a new front door. "Not all at once, but moment by moment, choice by choice, action by action." By evening, the diner was transformed, looking better than it had in years. But the real transformation was in the men who had done the work. They stood straighter, spoke more quietly, carried themselves with a dignity that came from creation rather than destruction. "What happens now?" Cooper asked as they gathered for coffee after the work was done. "How do we maintain this? How do we avoid slipping back?" Marcus looked around at the faces that just yesterday had been masks of drunk aggression, now showing hope and uncertainty in equal measure. "One day at a time," he said. "You come to the Sunday meetings. You help each other stay sober. You remember that real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself." The sun was setting over Pine Valley, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to promise new beginnings. The Red Ravens' leather jackets still lay in a pile, abandoned symbols of a past they were choosing to leave behind. Word had spread through town about the transformation at Jimmy's diner, about the wealthy veteran who had chosen a humble life and shown a group of lost souls the true meaning of strength. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a change that would ripple out far beyond the small mountain town's borders. 1 month after the confrontation that changed everything, Jimmy's diner hummed with a different, kind of energy. The Sunday morning sun streamed through spotless windows as Marcus prepared for the weekly veterans meeting. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for lost warriors finding their way home. Cooper arrived first, as had become his habit, helping to arrange the chairs in a circle. He moved with a new purpose now, his former aggressive stance replaced by quiet confidence. "Full house today," he said, setting out coffee cups. Words spreading about what happened here. Marcus nodded, watching through the window as more vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Former Red Ravens arrived alongside other veterans from across the county, all drawn by the story of transformation that had begun in this humble diner. "Still can't believe it sometimes," Jake said, entering with Brick and several others. They'd traded their leather jackets for clean work shirts, their faces showing the clear-eyed focus of sobriety. "A month ago we were terrorizing this town. Now look at us." The changes weren't just visible in their appearance. Tom's construction business was thriving again, staffed by former Ravens who'd found purpose in building rather than destroying. Others had found similar paths, some working with local veterans organizations, others in legitimate businesses that served the community they'd once threatened. Sarah moved through the growing crowd, serving coffee with a smile that showed no trace of the fear she'd felt that fateful day. "Mr. Chen," she called out. "Mary from the flower shop sent over fresh pastries for the meeting. Says it's her way of saying thanks for everything that's changed." The diner filled quickly, veterans of different eras and experiences gathering to share their stories. Marcus stood at the center, no longer the quiet diner owner, but a bridge between who these men had been and who they could become. "A month ago," he began, his voice carrying to every corner, "this diner witnessed something powerful. Not just the confrontation you've all heard about, but the moment when a group of lost warriors remembered who they were meant to be." He looked at the former Ravens. "Would you like to share what you've learned?" Brick stood, his massive frame now carrying dignity rather than menace. "Thought strength meant making others afraid," he said slowly. "Thought respect came from violence. Then we met a man who could have destroyed us, but chose to serve us instead, showed us what real power looks like. The hardest battle," Cooper added, "wasn't that day in the diner. It's been every day since, choosing to be better, choosing to serve rather than dominate, choosing to build rather than break." Outside, Pine. The other veterans nodded, understanding. In their eyes, many had walked similar paths, struggled with the same demons before finding their way back to purpose. Valley was transforming too. The fear that had gripped the small town was being replaced by something stronger, a sense of community built on redemption and second chances. Business owners who had once kept baseball bats under their counters now left their doors open late, knowing the former troublemakers had become their most dedicated protectors. "Got word from the sheriff yesterday," Marcus told the group. "Other towns are asking about our program. They've seen what's happened here, how a group of angry young men became pillars of the community. They want to know if it can happen elsewhere." Jake stood, addressing the newcomers who had come seeking their own transformation. "You want to know if people can really change? Look around this room. A month ago we were drunk, violent, lost. Now," he gestured to the diner, to his clear eyes and steady hands, to the respect he'd earned through service rather than fear. The morning continued, stories being shared, wisdom passed from one warrior to another. Veterans of foreign wars found common ground with young men who'd been fighting battles within themselves. The diner became a crucible where past pain was transformed into future purpose. "You know what I see when I look around this room?" Marcus asked as the meeting drew to a close. "I see strength, not the kind that comes from violence or intimidation, but the kind that comes from choosing to be better today than you were yesterday, from using your power to protect rather than destroy." The sun had climbed high over Pine Valley's mountains, its light filling the diner with warmth. Through the windows, local residents walked past, waving at the men they had once crossed the street to avoid. The transformation was complete, not just in the former Ravens, but in the community that had learned to believe in second chances. "This isn't the end," Marcus told them, beginning to clear coffee cups. "It's just the beginning. Each of you has the power to be what I was for the Ravens, a guide showing others that there's another way, that real strength isn't found in causing fear, but in helping others overcome it." As the veterans began to leave, each carrying a piece of the morning's wisdom with them, Sarah approached Marcus. "You know, Mr. Chen," she said thoughtfully, "when you first bought this place from old Jimmy, people wondered why a wealthy man would choose such a humble life. I don't think they wonder anymore." Marcus smiled, watching his transformed warriors heading out to continue their new missions of service and protection. The diner had become more than just his path to purpose. It had become a beacon for others, seeking their way home from darkness. The Sunday meetings would continue, drawing more lost souls looking for transformation. But the real miracle wasn't in the meetings themselves. It was in the quiet acts of service that now filled Pine Valley's days, in the former destroyers who had become builders, in the warriors who had remembered their true purpose. 1 year after the day that changed Pine Valley forever, Jimmy's Diner had become more than just a local restaurant. It was a symbol of transformation that drew visitors from across the country. The morning sun painted the newly expanded parking lot in golden light as Marcus prepared for another day of serving both coffee and purpose. The diner had grown, not in fancy renovations or upscale additions, but in the way that mattered most. The back room, once used for storage, had been converted into a meeting space where veterans gathered daily, not just on Sundays anymore. The walls were lined with photographs, the Red Raven's transformation captured in images of men moving. From destruction to creation. "National Veterans Association called again," Sarah said, entering through the front door. She'd become more than just a waitress. She was now the program coordinator for what they simply called the Way Home. "They want you to speak at their conference, share what's happened here." Marcus continued his morning routine, measuring coffee grounds with the same precision he'd once used to build military empires. "The story isn't about me," he replied, though a small smile touched his lips. "It's about them." As if on cue, trucks began pulling into the lot. Cooper's construction company vehicles, now bearing the logo "Warriors Building Tomorrow," arrived. First, his crew, mostly reformed Ravens and other veterans who'd found their way to Pine Valley, stepped out in clean work clothes, ready for their morning coffee before heading to job sites. "You see the latest news?" Cooper asked, settling at the counter. "2 more towns have started programs based on ours, former Ravens leading the way, showing others what real strength looks like." Jake entered next, now wearing a deputy's uniform. The transformation that had begun in the diner had led him to find his true calling in law enforcement, protecting the community he had once terrorized. "Got a situation, Marcus," he said, but his voice carried hope rather than concern. "Group of troubled vets just moved into the valley. They're angry, lost, just like we were." "Invite them for coffee," Marcus replied simply, already pulling out extra cups. The diner had become a first stop for lost warriors, a place where transformation began with a simple cup of coffee and a chance to see living proof that change was possible. Brick arrived with a group of newcomers, veterans from another town, who'd heard about Pine Valley's miracle. His massive frame, once used to intimidate, now served as a bridge between the lost and the found. "These men want to know if it's real," he said, guiding them to seats, "if people can really change." The diner filled with the morning crowd, regular customers mixing easily with veterans, former troublemakers sitting alongside the community members they'd once threatened. The fear that had once divided Pine Valley had been replaced by something stronger, understanding, purpose, and the kind of respect that comes not from intimidation but from transformation. "You know what's really amazing?" Sarah asked, serving coffee to a table of veterans. "It's not just about the Ravens anymore. Every person who finds their way here becomes a light for others. The change keeps spreading." She was right. Tom's construction company had become a model for veteran employment across the state. Cooper's program for teaching troubled vets trade skills was being replicated in cities nationwide. The Red Ravens leather jackets, still hanging on the diner's wall, had become symbols not of shame, but of possibility, reminders that the darkest chapters could lead to the brightest transformations. A newspaper lay on the counter, its headline announcing the expansion of what they now called the Pine Valley Model to veteran support programs across the country. Marcus glanced at it briefly, more interested in the real stories unfolding before him. The daily victories of men choosing better paths, the quiet transformations that happened over cups of coffee and shared understanding. "Got a letter from my old company," Marcus told Sarah during a quiet moment. "They want to fund veterans programs based on what we've built here. Funny how things come full circle. The money I walked away from coming back to serve a greater purpose." The morning sun climbed higher over Pine Valley's mountains as more vehicles arrived. The parking lot that had once held drunken Ravens' trucks now welcomed a steady stream of warriors seeking their way home. Each arrival carried the same look Marcus had seen that first day, the mixture of doubt and hope, of past regrets and future possibilities. "You ever miss it?" Cooper asked, watching Marcus serve coffee with the same care he'd once used to build billion-dollar defense systems. "The power, the influence, the empire you built." Marcus looked around the diner at the lives being transformed, at the community that had grown from fear to fellowship. "Power comes in many forms," he replied. "What we're building here, it's more valuable than anything I left behind." Outside, Pine Valley had become a different place. The streets that had once echoed with drunk Ravens' engines now rang with the sounds of community and purpose. The businesses that had once closed early in fear now stayed open late, protected by the very men who had once threatened them. A year had passed since that fateful confrontation, but its ripples continued to spread. The wealthy veteran who had chosen a humble life had shown not just Pine Valley, but communities across the country, that true strength wasn't found in wealth or violence or power. It was found in service, in transformation, in the quiet courage to choose a better path. As the morning continued, Marcus moved through his diner, serving coffee and purpose in equal measure. Each cup poured was more than just a drink. It was an invitation to transformation, a chance to learn what he had learned. That the greatest power comes not from making others fear you, but from helping them find their way home to who they were meant to be. 5 years had passed since the confrontation that transformed Pine Valley, and Jimmy's Diner had become a landmark that drew people from across the nation. The modest building now stood as a testament to the power of transformation, its walls echoing with countless stories of redemption and purpose. Marcus Chen stood at his familiar post behind the counter, his hands still moving with the same precise care, whether he was brewing coffee or mentoring troubled veterans. The diner had expanded, not with fancy additions, but with purpose-built spaces, meeting rooms, counseling offices, and a trade school center where veterans could learn new skills. Hard to believe it all started with a bunch of drunk rebels and a coffee pot, Sarah mused, now the executive director of the Pine Valley Veterans Foundation. The organization had grown from those first Sunday meetings into a nationwide movement, with centers in every state modeled after the diners. Humble beginnings. The morning sun painted familiar shadows across the diner's floor as the first visitors began arriving. They came from all walks of life now, military officials studying the Pine Valley model, veterans seeking transformation, and community leaders hoping to replicate their success. Cooper, who had risen to become the program's chief mentor, led a group of new arrivals through the diner's front door. "This is where it happens," he told them, gesturing to the seemingly ordinary space. "This is where we learn that real strength isn't about power. It's about purpose." The Red Raven's original leather jackets still hung on the wall, not as trophies, but as testimonials. Beneath them, photographs told the story of transformation. Jake receiving his police captain's bars, Brick opening a veteran-staffed security company, Tom's construction empire providing jobs to hundreds of reformed veterans. "You know what still amazes me?" Jake said, stopping by for his morning coffee before heading to the police station. "It's not just about veterans anymore. The principle works everywhere, showing people that real strength comes from serving others, not dominating them." He was right. The Pine Valley model had expanded beyond veteran rehabilitation. Schools used it to combat bullying, businesses adopted it for leadership training, and communities across the country implemented it to transform troubled neighborhoods. Marcus watched as a group of corporate executives toured the facility. They'd come to study how a small-town diner had sparked a national movement of transformation. Their expensive suits and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the diner's humble surroundings, reminding him of the life he'd left behind. "They still don't quite get it," Sarah observed, watching the executives take notes and snap photos. "They're looking for a program to replicate, but it's not about the program, it's about the principle. That true strength comes from choosing to serve rather than dominate." The original Sunday meetings had evolved into daily gatherings, with veterans from across the country making pilgrimages to the place where it all began. They came seeking not just transformation, but understand the diner had become more than just a restaurant or even a veterans center. It was a living classroom where the lesson was taught not through words, but through example. Every cup of coffee served, every meal prepared, every act of service demonstrated the power of choosing purpose over power. "Got something to show you?" Cooper said, leading Marcus to the back office. He opened a laptop, displaying a map dotted with points of light, each representing a center that had adopted their model. 5 years ago, it was just us. Now look, every light is another place where lives are being transformed. Nding, wanting to know how a wealthy veteran's choice to serve coffee had sparked a movement that changed thousands of lives. "Remember what you told me that first day?" Brick asked, now a respected community leader and mentor to troubled youth. "You said real power isn't about making others fear you. It's about helping them find their courage. Didn't understand it then. Live by it now." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows as Marcus prepared for another veterans meeting. The faces around him had changed over the years. Some had moved on to lead programs elsewhere. Others had found their own paths to purpose. But all carried the lessons learned in this humble space. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly, watching him work. "Walking away from your empire to serve coffee in a small-town diner?" Marcus looked around at what his choice had created. Not just a transformed community, but a movement that continued to spread, touching lives far beyond Pine Valley's mountains. The empire he'd built in business had generated wealth and influence. But this had created something far more valuable: hope, purpose, and the proof that true strength could transform lives. Outside, Pine Valley bustled with energy that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with purpose. The streets that had once echoed with drunk rebels' threats now rang with the sounds of community and service. The town had become a model for others, proving that transformation was possible not just for individuals, but for entire communities. As The sun began to set behind the mountains, casting its golden light across the valley. Marcus smiled at the legacy his choice had created. The wealthy veteran who had traded power for purpose had shown the world that true strength wasn't found in domination, but in service. Not in creating fear, but in fostering courage. Not in building empires, but in transforming lives. The diners. Dr. chimed as new visitors entered, seeking their own transformation. Marcus reached for the coffee pot, ready to begin again the simple act of service that had changed so many lives. Because in the end, that's what real power was about. Not the ability to destroy, but the choice to create. Not the capacity to intimidate, but the wisdom to inspire. And in Pine Valley, that lesson continued to change lives, one cup of coffee at a time.